I want to talk about something that I think most people who are building something have felt, but that very few people talk about honestly. The moment when the motivation disappears, not dips, not wobbles, the actual moment when you sit down to work on the thing you are supposed to care about, the thing you chose, the thing you started, the thing you've told people about and invested time and money into, and you feel nothing. No excitement, no drive, just a kind of flat, quiet emptiness where the energy used to be. I've had that moment more than once, and every time it happened, I felt something I wasn't expecting to feel: ashamed, because the narrative around building a business is that passion is the engine, that if you're doing the right thing, the motivation will be there. When the motivation wasn't there, when I was sitting at the laptop at 9 in the evening with a 4-year-old asleep upstairs and a 6-month-old who might wake at any moment, and the last thing I felt like doing was working on the business, I took that as a sign that something was wrong. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. What I've learned since then is that that interpretation was wrong. And this video is about what the right interpretation actually is. I think the shame around this specific feeling deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it's not really shameful about being tired. Everyone accepts being tired. It's a shame about what the tiredness seems to imply, that if you really wanted this, you'd feel it even when you're running on empty. And the fact that you don't feel it must mean something damning about your commitment. That belief is everywhere in how we talk about building things. It's in the quotes about passion being unstoppable, the stories about founders who just knew, the implicit suggestion that the right path announces itself through constant enthusiasm. I believed some version of that for a long time, and it made an already hard moment, sitting at a laptop with nothing left to give it, into something worse, a referendum on whether I belonged in this at all. I want to spend this video taking that referendum off the table entirely, because I don't think it was ever a fair one to hold. It was a Thursday. My youngest son had been going through a difficult stretch, not sleeping well, unsettled during the day. My wife and I had been running on broken sleep for about 2 weeks, the kind of tiredness that doesn't get fixed by one good night. That Thursday evening, both boys finally down, I sat at the table with my laptop and I opened it, and I just sat there, not overwhelmed, not stressed, just empty, like the part of me that cared about the business had quietly clocked off at some point in the previous 2 weeks, and nobody had told me. I want to describe that emptiness a bit more precisely, because I think people sometimes picture lack of motivation as something closer to procrastination, a mild reluctance you could push through with enough willpower. This wasn't that. It was more like reaching for something that used to be reliably there and finding the space where it used to live, simply vacant. Not painful exactly, not even particularly dramatic. Just a kind of low, grey stillness where the usual pull toward the work should have been. I remember opening the laptop and staring at the cursor blinking in an empty document and genuinely not being able to locate any reason, internally, to type the next word. Not because the reasons weren't real. I could have listed them if you'd asked me. I just couldn't feel them. And the thoughts that came were not helpful ones. Maybe I'm not as committed as I thought I was. Maybe if this were really the right thing for me, showing up wouldn't feel like this. I closed the laptop, went to check on my youngest, stood there in the dark for a while. my wife found me. There is a feeling that comes when you are genuinely done with something, when a path has run its course. That feeling has a particular quality to it. It is calm, it is clear, it arrives in the quiet, not in the storm. And then there is a completely different feeling that comes when you are exhausted and depleted and running on empty. That feeling has a completely different quality. It is not calm, it is heavy. It arrives in the middle of the difficult stretches. It is loudest when you are most tired. And here is the critical thing. From the inside, especially in the moment, those two feelings can seem identical. I have spent a fair amount of time since that Thursday trying to actually articulate what separates them, because you just know isn't a satisfying answer when you're the one standing in the dark trying to tell the difference. The closest I've come is this: genuine doneness tends to show up as absence rather than heaviness, a quiet sense that a thing has simply completed itself, with very little emotional charge attached. The way you feel when you finish a book you enjoyed and are ready to start another one. Tiredness, dressed up as doubt, on the other hand, tends to come loaded with urgency and self-judgment. It doesn't feel peaceful, it feels like an emergency, like something needs to be decided right now, tonight, in the dark, with a cot in front of you and no sleep behind you. That urgency is itself a clue. Real clarity, in my experience, is rarely in a hurry. How do I tell the difference now? I wait. I have a rule I've given myself. I do not make important decisions about the business during the hard weeks. Not about direction, not about whether to continue, not about whether something is working. Because the hard weeks are not a good time to evaluate anything clearly. Everything looks worse from inside the tunnel. I write things down instead. I know what I'm feeling and why. I give it a week, sometimes two, and then I look at it again. If it still feels the same way when I'm rested, then it's worth taking seriously. If it looks completely different, if what seemed like a fundamental doubt turns out to have been a particularly hard fortnight, then I'm glad I didn't act on it. Tiredness disguised as certainty is one of the most expensive things a business owner can act on. Wait, rest, then decide. I'll be specific about what writing it down actually looks like, because the format matters more than you'd think. I don't write a polished reflection. I write the raw, ugly version. Sometimes it's a single line. Don't want to do this anymore. Feels pointless. Exhausted. No editing, no trying to sound reasonable. The point isn't to produce something useful at the moment. It's to get the thought out of the urgent, decision-making part of my brain and into a container I can return to later with distance. 9 times out of 10, when I reread that note a week later, it reads less like a verdict and more like a symptom, a data point about how depleted I was on a given Thursday, not a conclusion about the business itself. The first thing is I reduce the ask. When I have no motivation, I do not try to push through and do the full version of whatever I was planning. I found the smallest possible version of it, not the whole content piece, one paragraph, not the full financial review, 10 minutes looking at one number, not because small is the goal, but because starting small breaks the paralysis. I think this works because the resistance you feel toward a task on an empty evening is rarely proportional to the task itself. It's proportional to the size of the task as your depleted brain perceives it. A full content piece looks, from inside that emptiness, like an impossible mountain, One paragraph looks like something a tired person could plausibly still do. And very often, once I've done the one paragraph, the mountain turns out to have been smaller than it looked from a distance. Not because my energy magically returned, but because starting is almost always the most expensive part of any task, and I'd already paid that cost. The second thing is I change what I'm working on. There are different types of work in the business. On the empty evenings, I do the administrative version, the things that need to happen but don't require my best. And I protect the creative work, the important work, the work that matters, for the mornings. This matching of task type to energy level took a while to become instinctive, and it required being honest with myself about something slightly uncomfortable, that not every hour I worked on an empty evening was actually producing anything of value, and pretending otherwise was a kind of self-deception. I used to sit down on depleted evenings and try to write something that needed a real thought, produce something mediocre, and then feel doubly bad, bad about the emptiness, and bad about the low quality output it had generated. Once I started deliberately routing the depleted hours toward invoicing, filing, replying to routine messages, things that need doing but don't need my sharpest thinking, the guilt mostly disappeared because I was finally asking those hours to do something they were actually capable of. The third thing, and this is the most honest one, is sometimes I just don't work. Not as a habit, not as a pattern, but sometimes the most responsible thing I can do for the business is close the laptop, sit with my wife for an hour, and go to bed at a reasonable time. Because the version of me that shows up tomorrow after rest is more valuable to the business than the version of me that pushes through tonight on empty. I want to be careful here because I know this can sound like permission to always choose the easy option, and that's not what I mean. This is specifically about the nights where the emptiness is total, not the ordinary reluctance everyone feels before doing something slightly effortful, but the genuine bottom of the tank depletion, where forcing the work would produce something worse than not doing it at all, at a cost to tomorrow that outweighs anything gained tonight. Distinguishing that from ordinary avoidance is a judgment call, and I don't always get it right. But erring toward rest on the nights that are genuinely empty has, over time, cost the business far less than the alternative would have. When I look back at the periods where motivation was the hardest to find, there was usually something else going on. Sometimes it was that I'd lost connection to the why. I was doing the tasks, but I'd got so far into the weeds that I'd lost sight of what I was actually building toward. Sometimes it was that something about the direction felt off, not dramatically wrong, just slightly misaligned. I want to give a concrete example of what losing connection to the why actually looked like for me, because it's easy to nod along with the phrase without picturing it. There was a stretch of a few months where I was doing genuinely good, technically competent work, the kind of work that on paper should have felt satisfying, but every session at the desk felt mechanical, like filling in a form. It took me a while to realize the reason. I drifted, gradually and without noticing, from the kind of work that had originally drawn me to this into a version of it shaped mostly by what clients were asking for. Nothing was wrong with any individual decision that got me there, but the accumulation of small drifts had put real distance between what I was doing day to day and the reason I'd started in the first place. And that distance was quietly draining the motivation out of every session, no matter how rested I was. And sometimes, more often than I expected, it was that I needed to feel progress. There's something about building a business, especially in the early stages, where the feedback loop is long. You put effort in today and you might not see the result for weeks or months. When I noticed this, when I recognized that part of my motivation problem was a genuine lack of visible progress, I started doing something very simple. At the end of every week, I write down 3 things that moved forward. Not 3 goals I have, 3 things that actually happened. Small things count. A new connection was made. A piece of content that landed better than expected. A process that is now documented that wasn't last week. The point is to make the progress visible, because when motivation is low, when I'm sitting at the laptop wondering if this is going anywhere, I can look at that record and I can see it is going somewhere. Sometimes you just need proof of the accumulation. I think this habit works for a reason that's worth naming explicitly. Human motivation, in my experience, responds far more reliably to evidence of movement than it does to the size of the eventual goal. A distant abstract vision of success, however genuinely exciting, doesn't do much for you on a Thursday evening when you're exhausted. A short, concrete list of 3 specific things that actually happened this week does something different. It's not inspiring in a grand sense. It's just proof, small and undeniable, that the effort isn't disappearing into a void. Over the months I've kept that weekly list, it's become less a motivational tool and more a kind of ledger, something I can point to on the hard weeks that argues quietly against the feeling that nothing is happening. Here is the most honest thing I can tell you about motivation after doing this for long enough. It is not a constant. It is not a fuel tank that stays full when you're doing the right thing. It is not the reliable engine that the motivational content online implies it is. It comes and goes, regardless of how committed you are, regardless of how right the thing is for you. There will be weeks where you wake up and you're excited and the work feels purposeful. And there will be weeks where none of that is true, where the same work that energized you last month feels heavy and pointless. Both of those weeks are part of building something real. I think the framing of motivation as a fuel tank is actually where a lot of the shame comes from. A fuel tank implies a steady, measurable resource that depletes predictably and refills predictably if you treat it right. Eat well, sleep enough, stay disciplined, and the tank stays full. When it doesn't stay full despite doing everything right, the fuel tank metaphor leaves you with only one explanation. You must be doing something wrong or wanting the wrong thing. I've come to think a better metaphor is weather. Motivation is more like weather than fuel. It moves through in patterns you can't fully control, shaped by forces well outside the immediate situation. Sleep, hormones, the news, how your kids slept, how a client conversation went 3 days ago. You can dress appropriately for the weather. You can't always choose it. And you'd never take a rainy Tuesday as evidence that you'd chosen the wrong country to live in. The people who build things over the long term are not the people who stay motivated. They are the people who keep going on the weeks they aren't, not by forcing themselves, not by playing motivational content at full volume until the feeling comes back, but by showing up in a smaller way, by doing the maintenance version of the work on the hard days and protecting the deep version for when they have more to give, by learning to tell the difference between tired and done, and making very few permanent decisions in temporary states, and by having someone, a partner, a person who knows what you're building, who can stand in the dark with you and say, I think you're just tired. I think those are two different things. You don't need to feel it every day. You just need to show up for most of them. I want to add one more thing here that I've only recently come to appreciate, which is how much it helps to expect the low weeks in advance rather than being surprised by them each time. For a long time, every dip in motivation felt like a fresh crisis, as though it were the first time it had ever happened, and therefore meant something was newly, urgently wrong. Once I'd been through the cycle enough times to recognize it as a cycle, low weeks followed eventually by weeks that felt lighter again, over and over. The low weeks stopped being alarming. They became familiar, expected even. That shift alone, from surprise to recognition, took a huge amount of the fear out of them, because a familiar pattern is much easier to sit through than an unprecedented emergency. I started this video by talking about a feeling I was ashamed of, the absence of motivation for something I was supposed to care about. And I want to end it by saying, if you felt that, there is nothing wrong with you, nothing wrong with your commitment, nothing wrong with your vision, nothing wrong with the thing you're building. You might be tired, you might have lost the connection to the why, you might just be having a hard week, and hard weeks end. The thing I know now that I didn't know that Thursday night, standing in the dark next to my son's cot, is that the feeling of not wanting to do it is not the final word on whether you should. It is just a feeling. And feelings, especially the ones that arrive in the exhausted hours, are not reliable narrators. I think about that version of myself standing in the dark fairly often, and what I'd want him to know isn't really a strategy. It's simpler than that. It's that the emptiness he was feeling wasn't a message from some deeper, truer part of himself, finally telling the truth about how he felt about the business. It was just what 2 weeks of broken sleep does to a person, dressed up in the moment as something far more significant than it actually was. He didn't need a new business idea. He needed a full night's sleep and a week to see clearly again. And it turned out that's exactly what he got. Rest when you need to. Show up smaller on the hard days. Keep the record of progress. And learn to wait before you decide. The motivation will come back. It always has. If this video describes a feeling you've been sitting with, drop a comment. Tell me where you are. Tell me what the hard patch looks like in your version of this. I read every single one. And I mean that. Subscribe, because there is a lot more of this coming. See you in the next one.